All right. Dr. T, that was awesome. I know I invested in Freakonomics at my house, and it's all about the we. So now we're rolling on to rethinking housing before, during, and after COVID-19. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ray Alexander, and I'm the Vice Chair of the 2020 Legislative Committee. Before I kick off the next session, I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording today's session and will embed the video in the virtual meetings portal for viewing later. So, having both a historic and a visionary perspective while challenging, it's vital as we look to address the state's housing industry. While many of the decisions of the past have gotten us to the point where we are, many have held us back and made the future more complicated and less able to respond to the moment we now face. Understanding the impact that the systems which stood up the industry on its future will place us on a path forward. Joining us today is somebody who has been a leader on the topics of housing finance, policy, and economic recovery for decades for a deep dive into what housing is, can be, and should be for our future. Michael Stegman is a senior housing policy fellow at the Milken Institute Center for Financial Markets. He has a pretty impressive bio, so I encourage you all to visit the portal or the stateofrealestateinc.com to read more about him. But what you won't read is something I know personally. He is a Tar Heel, woo, and a lifelong one, it seems like, because he used to watch Phil and Michael, and he loved them, and also was a big, fan of the Four Corners. Probably not the same Four Corners on the Franklin Street I'm a fan of, but both, I'm sure. So as Roy and Dean would say, let's get this session started. And remember, if you have any questions during Michael's presentation, please post them using the Q&A button. If time allows, we will answer as many as we can at the end of this presentation. So, Michael, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Ray, and thanks everybody for inviting me to participate here. I'm going to try to weave two themes together that I believe are related, and they are the impacts really of how COVID-19 is affecting North Carolina's housing market and the national housing market for that matter, and ultimately the need for land use reforms, regulatory reforms, and zoning reform. And the two are really linked by virtue of the pandemic really emphasizing and worsening really the supply constraints that affect North Carolina's housing market, particularly for starter homes and first-time home buyers. The importance of really being able to have your housing supply, particularly the supply of starter homes, expand in response to increases in demand. And more local leaders throughout the country are realizing that, along with trying to really support additional housing construction and production, they really need to turn their attention back to zoning and development regulations that really add to cost and make it difficult for the supply to expand. So Rachel, if you could put up the slides, and let's go to the outline that I have here. So it's two big themes, and the impact of the pandemic on the housing market, as I'm sure you've heard yesterday and today, really the North Carolina, and for that matter, the national housing market is withstanding, quite frankly, withstanding the pandemic well. but it's largely because of the policies of the Federal Reserve, substantial mortgage forbearance policies, and other government support of the market. The Federal Reserve has bought up over $2 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, which has really pushed our interest rates to virtual all-time lows, and is committed to remaining at these levels. The Fed is committed to remaining for some time to come. You also are probably aware that at the same time that we are at virtual all-time lows on interest rate, credit really has tightened for those with less than stellar credit scores. So this is exacerbating the racial wealth gap, the homeownership gaps, making it tougher first-time homebuyers and so on. What you may not be as aware of is that the pandemic has caused an enormous amount of turmoil in the rental market, and that's really where there could be cliffs heading, down the road several months from now, because what we have is tremendous cost burdens in the rental market pre-pandemic hitting head on with the impacts of the job losses and income losses, particularly on renters. And North Carolina families are really suffering, and I'm going to be able to point that out. And then there are a number of other clouds on the horizon I just want all of you to be aware of, and then we'll get into our discussion of zoning and development regulations. So if you would advance to the next slide and the next slide after that. So what we're starting with here is a visualization of really what has happened because of the pandemic. This is cellular phone data for the 40 largest metropolitan areas. Close to the top of that red curve is Charlotte. It's a blue curve, 3 or 4 curves down. But what it really shows you going back to January is the level of foot traffic to commercial activities in the 40 largest metropolitan areas. And then you see that sharp cliff. That's where we lost 20 million jobs. That's where the stay-at-home orders came. And that's really in the kind of March-April period. And then you see as economies and states and localities began to reopen at different rates, you begin to see the pattern of commercial activities really increasing. But as you can see, it's almost a proxy for what's happening in the job market, right? We lost 22 million jobs, and we've recovered about half of those. And you can see as that foot traffic increases, we're nowhere near where we were in January. So we've got a ways to go, and that's just one way of capturing how powerful the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders have been and the devastating impacts of the pandemic. Next slide, please. But overall, and as you've heard, across the country, the housing market has done pretty darn well. And if you look at the 4-quarter price change for each of the 50 states over the last year, from the second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020, North Carolina prices across the state on average have increased 5.9%. That's above the 5.4% for the country as a whole. And we're right about in the middle of where the price appreciation has been, a low of 1.1% in North Dakota to a high of 10.8% in Idaho. So across the state on average, doing pretty well. Next slide, please. But as you, I'm sure, heard and know about, given your business, At 1.9 months, the North Carolina supply of single family housing is very, very tight. The light blue is last year, the deep blue is this year. Look at the sharpness of that decline. If we think about what a normal kind of equilibrium would be between supply and demand, we're usually talking about a 6-month supply that defines the kind of long-term norm. And here we are at 1/3, less than 1/3 of that. So overall, and this is for the state as a whole, very, very tight supplies. Next slide, please. And if you home in on just where we have some data for these 4 metropolitan areas, you see Charlotte, Concord, Gastonia up 7.7% over the last year. Greensboro 10, Raleigh, Cary 6.5, Winston 7.2. But if you look at those smaller purple bars, this is just the last quarter, first quarter to the second quarter. More than 1%, right, in Charlotte, 2.2, 3% in Greensboro, and so on. These are very high, and so as we laud the lower interest rates, the reality is that the increases in housing prices in North Carolina and the country for that matter really offset the benefits, more than offset the benefits of the lower interest rates. Next slide, please. The previous slide showed you the shortage of supply overall in the sales market. What this does is it breaks down the housing supply into price tiers. The starter homes, right above the starter homes, the low, medium, medium, high, and that blue curve, the bottom curve, is the high priced quintile. And so what you're looking at here, that orange slide curve shows you how much more rapidly the prices of the starter homes for first-time home buyers, that lowest price tier, are increasing at a much steeper rate than the other price tiers. And so that translates not only into higher price appreciation, but it also translates, is reflecting actually the even lower supplies of that lower price tier housing. Next slide, please. This is the same, basically the same chart, but just for Charlotte. Again, that orange curve. Look at the space between the orange curve on the right, upper right, and the other curves. That's the rate at which the house price appreciation in that lowest price tier exceeds the rate at which prices are going up in the other tiers. And again, the most expensive single family housing is appreciating at the lowest annual rate. Next slide, please. You know, we talk a lot about the millennials and when they were going to emerge as a market force and really begin to show their power in demanding home ownership and how that could really buoy the recovery. And now what we find with the COVID-19, we find again a substantial increase in the number of young people who are back home living with a parent. And that obviously depresses household formation. Here, what you see from Pew is we're looking at an increase from January 2020 of 46% living with parents all the way up to 52%. And this is going to have a lingering effect on on local markets throughout the country. Next slide, please. So what we're told by the economists, there are 7 economic sectors that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. They are service workers, entertainment and media workers, small business owners, construction workers, sales workers, transportation workers, manufacturing or production workers. And as you can see, excuse me, the owners and renters working in industries most vulnerable to job losses and income losses are really scattered throughout all of our types of housing, from manufactured homes to single family, all the way through to large multi. But what is most important here is that those yellow bars, those are renters. And what we see, no matter what the housing type, renters are more likely to be workers in these vulnerable industries and potentially harder hit by the impacts of the pandemic than are homeowners, but everybody is being impacted. Next slide, please. So let's look at what's happening in the rental markets. You know, kind of to summarize, there is some data that does suggest that families are moving from more dense to less dense places. We have data from single family rental, big institutional owners that are seeing a boom in business, people that want to move from dense cities to a suburban location and are really renting single family homes from these institutional investors. We know that low income renters and renters of color are really hurting. We know that before the pandemic, we were losing low rent units at a substantial rate and gaining high income, high rent units. And also we now have the beginning of some data on the small landlords, the mom and pop landlords, and landlords of color who own 1 or 2 or a handful of rental properties, and really how they are faring during the pandemic, as well as how their tenants are faring. And we really need to pay attention to this really told story. Next slide, please. This is a very busy slide, and when you get a chance to download things, you can take a look at it more carefully. But this comes from a major Wall Street institutional investor who owns thousands of single-family rental houses, and he operates in many markets across the country. And what it shows is a snapshot of changes in rental applications between the second quarter of 2017, pre-pandemic a few years ago, and the first quarter of 2020, when the pandemic was just really becoming known. And in each state he operates in, what he's finding is a rise in the share of applications he's getting from out-of-state residents, with higher rates moving from markets in the Northeast. And his out-of-state application rates are way up in lower cost and lower tax, less dense cities. Next slide, please. Nationally, rents continue to climb much faster than general inflation. Beige color really is what is the inflation rate. And you can see the distance between the rate at which rents across the country have been increasing and the rate of inflation, and rents certainly have been exceeding the rate at which incomes are gaining as well. So we have a general drift upward of rents that is causing problems. And if we go to the next slide, what this chart shows is you've got three curves. The cheapest rents, under $600 rents, are the orange. The mid blue is $600 to $999, and then the deep blue is 1,000 over. And so when we say the multifamily market is doing well, the reality is that most new additions are in the higher end apartments. And you can see since 2014, the steepness of that deep blue curve. And that's really characteristic of most of the rental markets throughout the country. Next slide, please. Nationally, again, just staying nationally before we go back to North Carolina, what this shows is that we are losing our low-rent stock at a substantial rate. We've lost 4 million units that are renting for less than $800 since 2011. And those units are not being replaced nearly at the same rate. And we know that you can't replace units that rent at these levels without subsidies. And we haven't had a whole lot of subsidies. And so that market for lower rent tier housing is getting substantially tighter. And as you can imagine, if you go to the next slide, what does it do? That shrinking low rent supply leads to increasing rent burdens. And this is pre-pandemic. This is before all the steep income losses that we've suffered in the past year. And it will have hangover effects. It's important to see that blue bars, that blue-green, that really shows you people that are spending more than half their income for housing. So, at the very low income levels, 70 or 80% are paying half their income for housing. And that income is obviously declining. And even if you go into that next tier, 15 to 30,000, you're seeing up to 40, about 40% of every renter, all renters paying more than half their income for housing. And it's not until you get to the 50, the 30 and up, where you begin to see it's still in double digits. It's not until 45 to 75,000 that it's in single digits of people paying more than half their income for rent. And so if you go to the next slide, interesting, I don't have it for every one of our communities, but if you just look at what's going on in Charlotte Metro and Raleigh, Cary, Charlotte has gained substantially more low-income, under $25,000 renter households over the 10-year period, 2006 to 2016, while Raleigh has actually experienced a loss in the lowest income households, rental households. And that will vary by community to community. And if we go to the next slide, we'll go back into the world of the pandemic. What this simply shows is the housing and hunger pain that the pandemic is causing. This is all for renters. And what you see, 7.8 million renters are now behind in their rent. And these focus on only renters with children, with young children, and 6.5 million children in these renter households are going to bed hungry. And 3.4 million are both behind in their rent and also really food insecure. And then if you just go to that right side of this chart, and look at the percentages that suffer these problems. White, not Latino renters, 20%. For Black, 42%, Latino, 36%, and other multiracial, 34%. So really, renters of color are really facing enormous challenges these days, and we're still waiting to see if Congress will respond. Next slide, please. So if we go to North Carolina, we don't have the same kind of richness of the data, but just take a look at this. This is data collected for the week of July 9th to July 21st by the US Census. And what it shows is 27% of North Carolina renters did not pay their previous month's rent on time, or they deferred payment. 21%, about 1 out of 5 renters nationally were in the same situation. North Carolina, 27%, significantly more serious than the country as a whole. And if you go to the next slide, please. 59% of North Carolina, now this is August 19th to 31st. This is more recent than the last slide. 59% of North Carolina renters told the census takers that they believe that they're very or somewhat likely to be evicted in the coming 2 months. What's interesting, if you break it down by age, the youngest renters, most recently in their independent households, virtually every one of them are behind and are worried about being evicted. And it goes down to 61%, which is close to the average for the state as a whole for 25 to 39-year-olds, but only a third of those 65-year-old above, because more elderly are on fixed incomes and have not been as hard hit by the pandemic because of that, from the standpoint of their income. Next slide, please. Don't worry about reading all the small print here. It's summarized right in the title. There is a site that you can go to called Eviction Lab, and it ranks and gives a scorecard on how effective state policies are to helping renters, protect renters against eviction for non-payment during the national emergency. Massachusetts, with a rank of number 1, scores 4.15 points out of a maximum of 5. North Carolina is ranked 39th, just 11 from the bottom, with a score of 0.19 out of 5. So North Carolina tenants are seriously exposed to the potential of eviction in the coming months. And if you go to the next slide, this is really pre-pandemic, but what it shows you is 12 North Carolina mid-sized cities are in the top 100 in terms of eviction rates. And you can see Kinston is number 17 in the mid-sized cities in the country in the top 100, all the way down to Gastonia, ranked number 90. But these are the number of evictions that occurred in 2016 per 100 renter homes in an area. So when you see 10%, that means 1 out of 10 renters were evicted. And if you go to the right side of that chart, 7 North Carolina large cities are in the top 100 eviction rates. Greensboro is number 7 in the country in the large city category, at a little over 8%. All the way down to Raleigh, which is number 76 out of 100, just below 4%. So eviction is a big, big problem and epidemic in North Carolina. Next slide, please. All I'm going to do is show you quickly, next slide, please, a very innovative, a lot of innovation is taking place on how to protect tenants from eviction during the pandemic. This happens to be a Colorado legal services foundation funded advocacy project to work with renters. But basically, next slide, please. What it essentially does is what we have here is a foundation, a philanthropy, creating a housing fund that it's using to actually buy up, to purchase from landlords that tenants' past debt at a discount to help the landlord sell their rents receivable account at a discount. And also it's a futures based approach. It will buy from the landlord up to 6 months of future rent payments at a discount. The question is, how confident is the landlord that that tenant will not be able to pay full rent over the next coming months? And so he's created, I mean, this program has created a market for buying up debt. And then what the foundation does, the social impact funder does, it resells the debt, the discounted debt, back to the tenant in the form of a long-term zero interest loan. Or if it has to, it will convert it to a grant, but it's trying to spread some money around, help landlords and tenants at the same time. Lots of innovation happening around the country. I hope it's happening and wish it were happening more in North Carolina. Next slide, please. While institutional single-family rental investors, as I said in my summary, professionally managed rental properties are not only holding their own, in some cases doing even better than they were pre-pandemic, small landlords, not so much. And if you go to the next slide, 24 million rental units, 52% of all rental units are managed by do-it-yourself landlords, mom and pop landlords who own fewer than 10 units. They are generally unrepresented in policy discussions, and data on these landlords are really hard to come by. Next slide, please. And what we have is the development now of technology platforms that are actually managing for these small landlords, managing their properties, and at the same time able to collect data on them. And this one platform called thal, you see on the lower left part of the slide, is that over 1/3 of these do-it-yourself landlords and over 40% of their tenants are relying on savings to meet their monthly obligations during the pandemic. And it's particularly troubling for the 29% of landlords that are retired and using these small properties really as a source of retirement. Next slide, please. 12% of the landlords with mortgage, these small landlords with mortgages, said that they currently have at least one mortgage of their own in forbearance that they can't pay. And if you're talking about the landlords that own 2 to 4 units, properties with mortgages, 16% of them have at least one of their mortgages in forbearance. And go to the next slide, please. If we focus on the racial and ethnic breakdown of these small landlords by income, you see that again, Black and Hispanics are more likely to have lower incomes than their white counterparts. They're more likely to own only one property, and they are more likely to have a mortgage on that property. And if you go to the next slide, please. And despite their greater financial vulnerabilities, it is the landlords of color, the Black and Hispanic landlords, small landlords, are more likely than their white counterparts to be providing payment plans to their tenants. And you can just see the yes, 36% of whites owners are doing it, 42% of Black, and 48% of Hispanic owners. That's really very interesting finding, and maybe counterintuitive or not, but it's important for us to understand. Next slide, please. Here's a quick overview of some things to keep an eye on in the North Carolina housing market. You're all aware, certainly, of all the controversy around immigration policy and so on, but with respect to the pandemic, the administration put a temporary hold on high-skilled H-1B visas, the high-skilled labor. And it turns out, if you can see, really in January of 2020, this year, there were 61,000 of these H-1B visas issued. And then you see now in July 2022, 2,200. Turns out, it's small print on the left side, but it turns out that these are pretty important to the North Carolina, high-tech, high-skilled regions, including, obviously, including the triangle. For example, over this same, this time frame, you see the last bullet there, Charlotte and Raleigh metro areas each had about 4,400 H-1B approvals. So this is something to keep an eye on, and it's going to have, because they can get renewed for 3 years, it's going to have a continuing effect even after the national emergency if the temporary halt is not reversed. Next slide, please. So clouds on the horizon. I know the previous speaker said, don't be a Debbie Downer, but I'm going to give you some clouds on the horizon. Nonetheless, some of this data is not easy to come by, and you should be aware of it. So as of September 15th, about 3.7 million homeowners were in forbearance plans. That represents about 7% of all active mortgages. And we don't know yet how this will play out. It's not been a crisis because the forbearance period can extend up to a year. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have said you can add the unpaid principal to the end of the loan term. So that hasn't been much of a crisis at this point, and it may not be, but we should be aware of it. But if you go to the next one, about 1 million borrowers are now past due by at least 30 days on the mortgage, and they're not in a forbearance program, according to Black Knight, which is a data provider in this business. So that's really a problem. And we do see delinquency and default rates increasing nationally. You are probably aware, as industry members, that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, did provide a national moratorium on evictions that extends through December 31st, 2020. But there's some analysis that suggests that how that's being interpreted really depends on where you live, and so its effectiveness is questionable. And the hot link in the slide where it says effectiveness, that orange, is a New York Times article that explains this. And unless Congress intervenes, when that eviction moratorium ends, the one that ended under the CARES Act, the Congressional CARES Act, only applied to federally insured or guaranteed mortgages. The CDC moratorium on evictions covers a much broader swath of the rental inventory. So unless Congress intervenes with a substantial amount of rental assistance to help tenants pay back rent when the moratorium expires, millions of families and lots of rental investors could lose their homes, investments, livelihoods, and indeed retirement security. So this is really a huge cloud on the horizon, to put it mildly. And I mentioned early on about the tightening credit standards, even though interest rates are losing. And just for you to be aware, just as in the financial crisis, when they bought up foreclosed homes in bulk for cash, Wall Street's single-family rental institutional investors are once again poised to step in with another new product. This time they're creating a sales leaseback option to turn financially stressed homeowners into renters. This is obviously not something that we would like to see. There may be financially stressed homeowners that want to rent back their own homes, but we've got to do a better job of helping them keep their homes as homeowners. Next slide, please. So here we go to the second phase of our presentation. Let's start again at the national level, and then we'll kind of go, locally. What we see here are four curves. That light blue curve that's the highest on the upper right is what's happened to the cost of land. And you can see that that dark blue curve, which is the cost of construction index, basically crosses the cost of land in terms of the rate at which the cost is increasing around late 2015, and now significantly is rising significantly faster than the cost of construction. If you look at that lowest line, that orange line, that's inflation, that's the consumer price index. So you can see the rate at which land is inflating, and some of that has to do with available supply. It has to do with what you can build. It has to do with the nature of the regulatory environment. So that's really where we start. Next slide, please. I don't have time to summarize all the research, but there is really an accumulating body of peer review and high quality research that looks at the impacts of regulatory barriers on housing production, the ability of the construction and development industry to respond to increases in jobs, increases in demand. And what we find is that excessive regulations reduce and delay housing development. They can raise housing prices, they can aggravate affordability, and clearly increase income inequality and reduce economic growth. Which is why regulatory reform, in my view, is an important complement to policies to increase supply, and especially for first-time home buyers. And in those starter homes, those first homes, those lower price tier homes that we need more and more, because the more we pump subsidies and reduce interest rates and reduce FHA rates without expanding supply, all we're doing is inflating prices. Next slide, please. So there is some good news here, and generally speaking, North Carolina as a whole is not nearly like California and a number of other markets that have such restrictive land use and zoning regulations that you can hardly build anything. New Jersey and other places. What this really shows in those two red bars, Raleigh in the highest of the two red and Charlotte the next. For Charlotte, 19% and Raleigh, 29% of their 2018 sales of all housing sales were new construction. And what that suggests is that these two metropolitan areas and other parts of the state as well that are not reflected here have a greater ability than all those metropolitan areas to the left of these two curves in being able to respond to job growth, to be able to respond to increases in demand, so that you're not just having families bid on existing homes if they want to buy a home, but that the new construction market can take a sizable percentage of that demand through new sales. Next slide, please. Don't worry about all those numbers. Just look at the title. It's a very busy chart, but again, it highlights for Charlotte and Raleigh this notion of elasticity of supply. What it shows is over the longer haul, this is for 7 years, from the first quarter of 2013 to the first quarter of 2020, in the country, less than 2%, it's 1.6% actually, less than 2% of all new construction share of all home sales nationally were for starter homes. Okay, for all home sales, 2% were newly constructed starter homes. For Raleigh, not 1.6% like for the country as a whole, 6.9% of their total sales were newly constructed starter homes. And for Charlotte, 4% compared to that 1.6% for the country as a whole. So what this suggests is that these two markets, Charlotte and Raleigh, really, while there may be needs for reform and so on, are not nearly as restrictive as other metropolitan areas and other parts of the country. Next slide, please. Having said that, overall, the average cost of regulation in terms of what it contributes to the price of a new home is substantial. And what this is from a 2011 and 2016 survey from the National Association of Home Builders. What it shows is regulatory costs in the yellow during the development period, regulatory costs during construction in the blue. It averaged for the price of a new home $65,000 in 2011. It is now about $85,000. And if you look on the pink, that chart on the right, if you look at the consumer price index over this period, went up 6.1%. The producer price construction materials went up 10%. Gross domestic product per capita in the country went up 15%. Regulatory costs for a single family home went up basically 30%. So anything that large, and this is not to say that all of these regulatory costs are bad, and they're absolutely not. But when you get to this level of impact on home costs, development and construction costs, it is certainly worth scrubbing and to really take a closer look at whether or not you've got redundancies and excessive regulations that can be streamlined. If you go to the next slide, we're going to go into zoning reform. And if you go to the next one after that. All right, I know I know. Few of you support mandatory inclusionary zoning for rental housing. I know that. I've been told that. I've been told to get rid of this slide, but I refuse to because I think it's an important tool. But anyway, it is a moot point for rental housing in North Carolina. Go to the next slide, please. Because North Carolina law prohibits rent control. I still don't think a ban on rent control should ban inclusionary zoning for rental development because communities can provide density bonuses and other kinds of incentives to affect the overall economics, to try to keep the overall economics, even though you're setting aside 15% of your units for long-term affordability. I think there are ways of coming pretty close to neutral on the cash flow and the pro forma. But in any event, it is a moot point, so let's move on. There are recent notable local zoning reforms across the country. I think there's really need for national action, but local officials increasingly are recognizing these realities that I'm talking about, and those are hot links that you can click on when you can download these slides. The most local example there in Durham, in October of 2019, right, passed an ordinance allowing duplexes and accessory dwelling units on properties currently zoned for single-family homes in neighborhoods ringing downtown. Really, all of these reforms are about increasing development capacity in certain neighborhoods that have been zoned exclusively for single-family. Primarily allowing duplexes to be built, and in some cases accessory dwellings to be built on single-family lots. Next slide, please. So there's a conservative think tank called the American Enterprise Institute who's calling for light touch density. And light touch density is really what this is about. It's allowing duplexes and in some cases 2 to 4 unit structures to be really to be developed in single family zones. So in 1940, as you see, it says 15% of all single family 1 to 4 housing units were actually in 2 to 4 unit structures. That is now 8% of all single family housing is in 2 to 4 structures. And if we were to return to that same 1940s, what they called the light touch density, you could significantly increase the supply of housing without really having to dramatically increase existing infrastructure. Again, hot links on those. You see those examples that you can see what has been going on in these communities. And what Atlanta has done is, instead of calling it light touch density, they call it, and others too, missing middle. What we really want to do is bring back the missing middle housing through these light touch density reforms. And again, just focusing on Atlanta for a minute, between 2005 and 2014, Atlanta lost more than 9,000 residential units in those multifamily buildings with between 2 and 9 units. And before they adopted what was the current zoning ordinance, which they adopted in 1982, duplexes, triplexes, and these small apartment houses were legal in most of Atlanta. And that 1982 zoning ordinance wiped those out, made those illegal. And Atlanta believes that they provide those buildings, those 2-unit buildings, the small multi-properties provide invisible density that's virtually indistinguishable from single-family houses. And they provide naturally occurring affordable workforce housing because they're less expensive than the single-family buildings. So they passed an ordinance to make missing middle housing legal again. And what's really important about this slide and the notion of light touch density, the argument about zoning reforms, the argument about exclusionary zoning is all about not wanting to bring these high rises and these big high density multifamily to your single family neighborhoods. That's not what this is about at all. Light touch density is about bringing and making it possible to create 2-unit homes in these zones and to bring back that missing middle. And so I will close with that final slide. And it is a question that's asked. You can get the column from which I took it, but the question is really about leadership and bringing everybody along. So it's, can city leaders who in theory know local conditions best be trusted to build the housing we need, or will they continue to pursue policies that pump up property values, perpetuate sprawl, and punish low-income renters? And with that, I will thank you.
Wow, Michael, that was great stuff and great insight. It sounds like we're gonna have to be ready for a tsunami of renters and assistance. So once again, that's why I'm going to say that that's why we are big into RPAC, and also we should give to RPAC to help fight for these people, because they are our renters, our landlords, and as Amy Hitchcock would say, and also the people that take care of those. So thank you so much, Michael. We're now going to take a short break, grab a snack, stretch your legs. I know, Marion, you need to grab another cup of coffee, and we will see you back here in 3 minutes for Tony.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thanks everybody for letting me participate.
Thank you, sir.